So in the past, I talked about good research questions and bad research questions, often focusing on the structural aspect of the question, talking about things such as it has to be clear, it has to be short, it has to be focused and doable and realistic, and you don't want to ask more than one question in one question. You're also likely to have heard similar advice from textbooks, maybe your teachers. But the problem is that quite often we have a research question that's good on paper, and yet it still leads to a very poor study. So I want to explore this in this video and explain how this happens and how to avoid this with one simple technique, one simple explanation. So long story short, or short explanation for this problem, is that you generally think of your research questions at the wrong point in time. And I can't blame you, because it's very common to hear the advice that says a research question is a starting point of a study. In fact, I feel like I'm probably guilty of giving that advice in the past as well, because I feel like I may have said that a couple of times. So it's a very common view that a research question is the foundation, of course it is, of any study, and therefore you start any study with posing a strong and good research question. However, the problem with this statement is that although it's actually very close to be accurate and very close to reality, in fact, it's not exactly what happens. And you don't want to start your study by asking a research question or posing your research question. You want to start your study by exploring the situation and understanding what there is to be explored or understood or improved or changed. And only then, based on this very good understanding, you want to start thinking of a research question. So generally what I describe is known as a rationale. So you may have heard this expression, this word. It's a rationale, so this detailed background of what's happening. So the so-called research problem. It doesn't always have to be a problem. It doesn't always have to be something negative, but quite often it is something that we want to change or improve or understand. So this also leads directly to the implications of your study, and that's a very important part of your rationale are these implications. Of course, detailed implications, so how we're going to use your findings, who's going to benefit, how they will use your findings or implement them into practice, is something that you won't know until you've done your actual study, you've done your data analysis. So that's the, let's say, detailed implications of the study. But overall, before you even start, you are expected to know, or have a very vague and general idea of who will benefit from the study, because again, it's part of that problem that we're trying to understand through our study. And the reason this is all important is because only through having such good understanding of what is happening, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or maybe we just want to explore something or evaluate and understand, but only based on that detailed understanding of what is happening, and therefore what we generally want to be the outcome or the goal. So again, whether somebody benefits from it or something is improved from it, only through that good understanding we can pose a research question that actually is aligned very well with that rationale. And that's the key point in this video. Your research question absolutely has to be aligned with the rationale, and only this way can it be a good research question and can your study be a good research study. And quite often this is simply not the case. So quite often you ask me, for example, sometimes in comments or sometimes when we meet in our online tutorials, you ask me, is this a good research question? So you give me a research question and you ask my opinion if it's a good research question. And whilst I can tell you whether it's a good research question on paper, as I said at the beginning of this video, so generally structurally whether it sounds like a good or realistic or doable research question, I can never tell you if it's a good research question without knowing exactly what's happening, knowing that background and that rationale for your study. So that's usually what follows. If you ask me about your research question, I ask you back and I ask you about the whole situation and what's happening, so that you can tell me and I can then tell you if it's a good research question. Just before I continue, I wanted to remind you that if you want to meet face-to-face and get some more personalized support, feel free to explore my website for all sorts of services that I offer, including planning, study, talking about research questions, talking about any other aspect of implementing or planning a qualitative research study. So now just to give you a quick example, imagine, so like I said, I have lots of these exchanges and conversations with you guys. Imagine we're meeting and I'm asking you about the research question, or you're asking me about your research question if it's good. Your research question is how to improve health service quality of health service, or maybe health service access for refugees in a certain country. So is it a good research question? How to improve access to health services in that country, for specifically to refugees? Sounds good, but then I have to ask you, what's happening? Why do we need to know that, basically? So your answer is, well, it's important to have access to health services. That's why we need to know how to improve access to health services to these refugees. And to this, I agree. However, my question is there no good access to to health services at the moment? And to this, sometimes you may, for example, be confused and you're not able to give me the answer, which means something is wrong here. So why are you asking if you don't know? I would expect that if there is no access or there is poor access or something like that, and we know this because you've done your reading, you understand the situation, and from there you develop the question because you want to know how to improve it. Otherwise, it's definitely not a good research question. And if that was your starting point and you're thinking maybe it's anecdotal evidence, maybe you know about it, but you have to have evidence for this. You have to have a very detailed explanation and description of this situation, because you will be asked these questions over and over and over again. So the same questions that I asked you. And another thing is that your questions have to be focused. So health services in general is quite a general term. That's another thing. And now let's imagine we're continuing our conversation, our little exchange, and you're saying, okay, I'll narrow it down. I'll talk about mental health services. And I want to specifically ask about how to improve these services. And the rationale, so I'm asking you about the rationale. Okay, tell me more about it. The rationale is, you tell me that these migrants or these refugees, they do struggle with a certain conditions. So for example, traumatic experiences, they have trauma and depression. So we know they have certain problems. At the same time, we do know that they don't access these mental health services. So for this reason, we want to know how to improve these mental health services. So that's your rationale. As you may expect, it's so much better already because you're giving me evidence. That's really important. Everything seems to nicely be glued together, basically, because you're telling me they have these experiences, they have these problems, these mental health problems, and also we know they don't access the services. So that actually sounds like a pretty good rationale. But just think about that question for a moment, because we're asking about how to improve these mental health services, and tell me, is it a good research question? So I'll just give you a few moments to think about it, or just pause the video and think about it, because I won't be waiting. But the answer is not exactly a good research question. It is a good research question for a certain study, but not based on what you just told me. Because what you just told me, and based on what you just told me, I want to ask, why are they not accessing these services? Or what are the barriers to mental health service access for refugees? Or what are these refugees' experiences of accessing or using mental health services? Something like that. So really depends, because it will depend on what we know and what we don't know. If we know, for example, from some similar literature into similar groups, maybe from similar backgrounds and countries, we know, for example, there is stigma and they generally don't want to access mental health services. That's interesting, and that in that case, we may also narrow, the question down a little bit and maybe ask, whether stigma plays a role, or maybe, is there stigma related to mental health services. So it really depends on what we know, and then based on that, we can shape our research questions. But just knowing that they don't access, we want them to access, it's available, they need it, but they don't access, there is nothing for me to suspect that we want a research question asking how to improve these services, because it simply is not what these facts are telling us. The facts are telling us they don't access these services. So we want to know why. So that's probably the main thing. We want to ask maybe even a question, why are they not using these services? So as you can see, this will always be true. Based on what we know, we ask certain questions. Just like the question about stigma that I ask, it only makes sense if we, for example, have a reason to think that there is stigma, or we know from similar research there is stigma, then we'll ask about this stigma. If it's just a random question about stigma, then again, my first question to you will be, why are we asking about stigma? So you have to remember, it may sound complex, but it really isn't if you really start by exploring this research problem or phenomenon or situation. And then you'll see that based on such explorations, this research question will basically reveal itself to you. It's really not that difficult. Whereas if you reverse the order, you'll face plenty of problems, because you'll have this research question and you will always struggle to justify it, to think about these problems and why we need it, who needs it, why are we asking this question. And this is it on this topic. If you want to know more about the structural aspects, as I said, of research questions, I do have this video. You'll see it very soon on your screen. Otherwise, if you enjoyed the video, if you learned something new, please like the video. Let me know what you think. Let me know about your study and your research questions. Maybe consider subscribing if you're not a subscriber, and sharing with others if you know others who may benefit from this instruction. And meanwhile, enjoy this video about research questions.